treats this time. He got smart. I was gonna feed him this whole time. Don't even care. Oh, they're almost gone. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Composer Tea. My name is Miss Sperotto, and this is my co-host Kitty. He does nothing, and I don't think he wants to be here today. Too bad. Today, we will be spilling the tea on a composer of my choice. But wait, you're kind of getting a 2-for-1 deal on this composer tea this week. A twofer, a buy one, get one. This week we're going to be talking about the Mendelssohns, and in particular, Felix and Fanny Mendelssohn. Yes, that was actually her name, and it was kind of a popular name in its day. They're actually brother and sister, and they were both composers. However, their lives were so intertwined that it's almost impossible for me to talk about one without talking about the other, so I might as well just talk about them both. Felix Mendelssohn wrote over 750 pieces during his lifetime, and he is most famous for A Midsummer's Night Dream, both the overture and the incidental music, Hebrides Overture, his Italian Symphony, and his Violin Concerto in E minor, which I absolutely love. I'm a little partial, though, being a violinist. And then Fanny Mendelssohn, she wrote 460 pieces herself, but she was most well known mostly for her songs and piano work. So some of those were Das Jahr, her Ether Sonata, her only orchestral piece, Overture in C, and her string quartet in E minor. So let's talk about their childhood. Their dad was a wealthy banker. I actually don't know a lot about their mom at all. I know her name was Leah, and I know that how she died. But other than that, that's all I know. Their dad was the type of man who thought that education and intellect was something that was to be highly prized, which I agree with. Oh my gosh, okay, fine, bye. What is your deal, little man? You want more treats? Come here. Look at this treat. Will you be a nicer kitty if I give you a treat? Really, it's just dry cat food? And then he's like, oh my gosh. With Felix and Fanny, they lived in a family with 2 other brothers and sisters. So there were 4 kids total, and they were born in Hamburg, Germany. A side note that has nothing to do with this family or music, that's where they think the first hamburgers originated from. This is actually a veggie burger, it's not a for real thing. I don't know how to cook meat in my house. Oh, this is a nice tea. This is a ginger peach tea. It's like a black tea base. Yeah, this is good for spring. Feeling this. Anyways, Fanny was the oldest of all these 4 kids, and she was born in 1805, and then Felix was born 4 years later in 1809. They didn't live in Hamburg forever. The family had to move to Berlin, and they were escaping Napoleon's armies at the time, so that was like 1811. So they were still kids. They were still little when that happened. I'm not entirely sure on everything that happened. I know that they had to leave Hamburg in disguise, and it had something to do with their dad's job in the banks with Napoleon. I'm not entirely sure, and to be honest with you, I don't know enough about banking to like be able to communicate the for real words with you. I just know that they like had to leave. So the family went to Berlin, and they actually lived there for the rest of their lives. No more burgers. Dude, that sucks. Now, because their dad was a wealthy banker, they lived a very privileged life growing up. There was none of this, we lived a poor life and woe is us and all of it. These were some privileged kids. They didn't have any financial problems or worries. They didn't grow up with that. Both Felix and Fanny started taking piano lessons, and they kind of did it at the same time, because like, why don't you just do them both at the same time kind of a situation. And Fanny, being 4 years older than Felix, was doing much better at piano for a little while. And there was at one point her piano teacher was like, yo, we got a child prodigy situation right here. This girl, she's good. There was even a compliment that was paid to her, and they said that she played like a man. That was like a weird roundabout compliment, saying like she played really well. Eventually, Felix did catch up with her, and he became quite good. Audiences, they were actually amazed with Felix because he had a lot of technical skill, and he also had like a lot of emotional expression on the piano. And throughout his life and throughout his compositions, he was very well known for that. So after a while, these side-by-side lessons, they kind of stopped. Fanny was about 15 at this time, and she was told she had to stop because she had to prepare to become a wife and a mother. This was a time period she lived in where women didn't compose music at the time. It was not a thing for ladies to do. Now, casually playing piano every now and then wasn't a big deal, but as far as public performances and publishing your music, that was not seen as a thing that a well-to-do lady at the time should be doing, ever. And the society they lived in back then, that's just how it was done. And their dad agreed with this. And he said, music will perhaps become his, or Felix's, profession, while for you, it should only be an ornament. I mean, that's kind of sad. Now, I know some of you, like, automatically will react and be like, how can you, like, not support your daughter? Okay, yes, I can see you being upset. And not to defend this, but there's a very, very long history of women being excluded from musical training and performances. And it wasn't really until World War II happened that we started seeing women actually get more involved in a musical profession, because all the men went to war, and, well, if you still want music, who's going to play it? The ladies. What was also happening in World War II, they kind of hired all these women and realized, oh dang, they play better than some of the guys we used to hire. So that's when they started getting a little cooler about it. And that's another reason in Composer T, every single episode I've done for you so far, it's just been about, without a better way of saying it, white European males. It's because at the time, that's who music was available to. And this has been noted throughout history. Like, we realize, oh, well, this is a thing. Is it a good thing? No. You can't be mad about it right now. It's already happened. And it's a part of our world's history right now. All we can really do about that now is to learn from it and do better. And we now know that music is for everyone. Anyways, so Dad wasn't supportive, and Felix, he wanted her to still compose, but he definitely agreed with Dad in the fact that, no, you should not be publishing music. That's not what ladies do. So Felix was basically like, you can compose, but it can't be public. Like, people can't know that you're actually doing this because you're a lady. And again, this was a social construct of the time. It wasn't just these two guys being not nice. Throughout Fanny's life, Felix was very wary of her publishing her own work, and he didn't like it when she tried to. So he knew that his sister was a really good composer, so what he did instead was he arranged for some of her songs that she had written to be published with his, but under his name. And at the time, that was not uncommon. If you were a woman and you were writing a book, composing music, any of those things, a lot of times women would either publish under a man's name or they would have an actual person that was well known who was a dude publish it for them. It happened a lot. Funny story about this, about 20 years later, Felix went to go meet the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, and her son Prince Albert. And Queen Victoria was like, "Oh, dear Felix, I absolutely loved one of the songs you composed in that book of yours." Which was really funny because Felix had to admit to Queen Victoria, thanks, but that actually wasn't my piece. That was my sister's. Oh. So time goes on. They're growing up. Felix continues composing. He goes to university in Berlin. He becomes a virtuosic composer and performer, just like he wanted. He becomes like instantly successful. Another thing he does at the time is he got really into Bach, like Johann Sebastian Bach. At the time, Bach's music had fallen out of favor, so while he was at the university, he started really studying it. And while he was there, he did a performance of St. Matthew's Passions from Johann Sebastian Bach. And because of that performance, he kind of single-handedly brought back Johann Sebastian Bach's music. So actually, if it weren't for Felix, we probably wouldn't know about Bach today. Good job. Now, Fanny, during this time, they write letters back and forth, and a lot of these letters, they express of how jealous she was. I think that's a natural reaction to have when the life that you wanted, you literally are not allowed to have. She gets married, just like she was told to. Well, she also wanted to. And she actually loved this man. His name was Wilhelm Hansel. And they actually tried getting married when she was younger, but her mom and dad, they both said, "No, honey." And it's because Wilhelm was an artist. And as an artist, sometimes it is hard to make sure you have a steady stream of income. And if you're going to be starting a family, you need to make sure you have a steady income. So they were like, "That's really cute that you found this man and you're like ready to get married and have a family just like we wanted you to." However, that's not gonna work out. Hey, if you're not gonna be in the actual video, then you need to come, stop interrupting. Don't look at me like that. Kitty, you want some treats? Bribing the cat. You gotta come up here. Oh, I'm not gonna just give them to you. Look. Oh yeah, that's the stuff. Here, come here. Walked away. He touched his gross food. However, good thing that did come out of this is eventually, because Wilhelm was very good at being an artist, he eventually was appointed to the Academy of Fine Arts, and then that's when Fanny's parents gave them their blessing so that they could get married. Luckily, her new husband, Wilhelm, was very supportive of her composing. Yay! I honestly don't think it would have worked out if he wasn't. She still had other responsibilities. She still had to be a mom. They did have one kid together, but she was still able to compose in that time. It's just she had other responsibilities she had. The other thing was she was still able to host musical events. She did a lot of things in her community in Berlin that had to do with music. There's at one point she organized a small chorus. So she was still active in music. It was just the actual composing, publishing, performing in public part that was frowned upon. Felix, on the other hand, was in demand across Europe. Everybody wanted Felix. He did have a professional blow. It was about 1833. I don't think he had very many of them. This was one of the very few. This was when the Berlin Sing Academy, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I'm pretty sure I am. They did not name him as the new musical director. So the Sing Academy in Berlin was kind of like a musical society. During the time when Felix and Fanny were alive, there were different musical groups associated with that. So they had an orchestra, they had a chorus, they had a really big music library, they would host different events. It was just the musical hubby kind of place in Berlin. And the Mendelssohn family had been members for a while. Like it went back. And historians think he didn't get the position for a few reasons, but one of the main reasons at the time was because he was really young, and all the older people that were also a part of this association didn't want a young guy coming in and messing up all their stuff. Back in my day. I think I've literally actually said that before. I'm only 35. So instead he started conducting at the Rhine Music Festival and also the Leipzig, I'm going to butcher all this because I do not speak German. Gewandhaus Orchestra. If you're watching this and you speak German and you just saw me struggle, I'm really sorry. Languages are not my thing. So 2 years later, he actually became the musical director for that orchestra. So in a weird way, like, it still kind of worked out. He became the musical director. And that was in 1835. That same year, Felix and Fanny's dad had passed away and he died of a stroke. And suddenly, because of that, Felix was the man in the house. So he kind of decided, like, okay, I need to be a grown-up now, or whatever. And he's like, I need to get married. And he did, and it was a lady named Cecile. The rest of the family, like Felix's family, didn't really like her, but they seemed to be mostly happy, except for a lady named Jenny Lynn who entered the picture, but like mostly happy. I know what you're up to, Felix Mendelssohn. Also around this time, since he is now the man of the house, Felix Mendelssohn took it upon himself to impart his wisdom on his sister. And there were discussions that came up now that their dad had passed, like, well, maybe now that dad is gone, I can start composing now. And Felix was like, you are too respectful of a woman to be doing that. Again, that's the society they lived in the day, but that's what it was. However, despite this, Fanny started to flourish as a composer after this. And this was like in the 1840s. So she and her family, they spent most of their time in 1840 in Italy. And I think this was very inspiring to her. And not only was this an inspirational time for her, but when she was in Italy, she was in the center of all of these admiring fans of her work. They were like, oh my gosh, we love you. So when she and her family came back from Italy, she had like this newfound energy and inspiration. And she kind of had this attitude now, in a good way, of, I don't need Felix to help me publish my music. So she actually started this process of like starting to get her work more out there. During her lifetime, she never actually was able to publish any of her work, but I think she started getting more out there in the public. Which brings us to our first piece that I'd like to speak about today, which was composed by Fanny, and it's called Das Jahr. When it's translated to English, is called The Year. It's written all for piano, and it's kind of like about her trip that she took to Italy. Oh my gosh. It reflects and represents her own life and also the passage of time, because the name of the piece is literally called The Year. This is definitely written in the romantic style of the day. Something that I think is really cool about this, which I had never heard of before, was that her composition was actually written on tinted pieces of paper, like different colors, and then the composition was then illustrated by her husband Wilhelm. And with each piece came a little poem to kind of go along with the feel of that single composition. I just think that's a clever idea. If you go back and listen, there's different sections. It's like one piece for each month of the year. So you have the January composition, for an example, and it has a certain color piece of paper, a certain artwork, and a little poem to go along with the composition she made. So there's a collection of 12. I think it's brilliant. Different music critics kind of show, not only does this show like a passage of time or of someone's life. They kind of have a feeling like there's this melancholy feeling or a feeling of loss. And maybe she was feeling that at the time, but it's very well written. This is something she wrote about her own piece. I've been composing a good deal lately and have called my piano pieces after the names of my favorite haunts, partly because our pleasant excursions were in my mind while I was writing them. They will form a delightful souvenir, a kind of second diary. But do not imagine that I give these names when playing them in society. They are for home use entirely. Just so you know, all those names are in German, and I don't speak German, so I can't even tell you them. Sorry. I barely passed Spanish in high school, so I'm sorry. I think this is one of those nice pieces for me, and it's kind of, if you just put it on and play it in the background while you're at home, maybe you're relaxing, have some tea. It's really nice. Actually, my favorite month, if you go listen to the recording, is September. I like the beginning of it a lot. When I listen to some of the months that they have in here, I think to myself, that would sound super cool as a string quartet. However, Fanny didn't really write for strings very often at all, and it's because she didn't have the experience or the background knowledge to do that. Usually when you are a composer and you go to learn how to do those things, you do it at a university. You have some kind of lesson on it. And she didn't play a string instrument, and she kind of had to stop her music studies. But Felix, who does have a lot of orchestral work and a lot of string work, he learned those things when he went off to school. So it kind of makes you wonder, or at least it makes me wonder, what would this piece have become had she been able to study music? It's fantastic on its own. I love it, and I love everything about it. But could it have been something more? We'll never know. During about the same time, Felix was having his own successes. He actually wrote one of his most well-known pieces, A Midsummer's Night Dream. So originally, this was just an overture. And he wrote the overture when he was 17 years old in 1826. An overture is an orchestral piece, and it's typically played at the beginning of a larger work. So it's like the opening piece. And he wrote this after reading a German translation of Shakespeare's A Midsummer's Night Dream. And he was very inspired by it, and he just wrote this entire overture. But later on, around the time we're talking about, in 1842, so this is like 16 years later after he wrote the overture, he wrote A Midsummer's Night Dream as incidental music. So incidental music is music that is written for a play, or in modern times, like a film. And having music with a play or in a film, it helps create atmosphere. So actually music can be very important in plays and movies. King William IV of Prussia, he actually commissioned this piece, this incidental music, for Mendelssohn to write for a production of Shakespeare. And it was really there just to enhance Shakespeare's text. So in Act 1, there's actually no music at all, but in Acts 2 through 5, you start hearing some echoes from that original overture that he wrote 16 years earlier. What's interesting about this, and still very relevant today, one of the pieces that he wrote between the 4th and 5th acts of A Midsummer's Night Dream is the very famous Wedding March, which he composed for that particular play. And actually is probably the most famous thing he has ever written. I don't think he meant it to be like that, but that's the piece that's played most often today. That and probably his violin concerto, which is really good. You literally hear that piece at almost every wedding ever. So it happens in a ceremony when the person goes, "I now pronounce you man and wife." And then they like turn to the people, and then you hear never had to play that ever. You probably didn't know you were listening to Felix Mendelssohn. Did you? So later on, after he wrote this became popular because Queen Victoria's daughter, when she got married, she decided, after the person says, "I now pronounce you man and wife," I want this to be played as I walk back down the aisle. Ever since then, it's been a tradition. So if it weren't for that particular wedding, we probably wouldn't be playing that in wedding ceremonies today. So trendy. If I'm going to have an opinion about this, I actually think the overture is more of a standout piece. I think that because he uses some cool instrumental effects for the time. Like there were different parts and you can hear the strings and it kind of actually sounds like fairies dancing or fairy feet. And that's just a personal opinion. You can feel free to disagree with me. So it's like 1944 right now. And Felix has been like really busy with his career to the point where I'm not entirely sure he was enjoying himself. He's getting kind of tired. So he's been in Britain for a while. He's doing a lot of conducting jobs. Because his schedule is like so jam-packed, it was like packed as in like for every 3 weeks it's like filled, his days. Did he have like a tour manager? I don't know. He was not going to bed until really late at night, but then having to wake up early because he had this big schedule. And his life was like that for a little while. And I think he was just overworked. One cool thing though is that he, at this time is when he got to meet Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and like do a lot of cool things. So he was basically like a rock star. And he would often just complain about his workload because it was just too much for him. All he wanted to do was just be back home with his family. Interestingly enough, while Felix really wanted to take a step back from his career, Fanny's career was flourishing. So it's a few years later, it's May of 1847, and Fanny's in a rehearsal, and she's doing this for an upcoming performance, and all of a sudden, she goes to sit down at the keyboard, and her hands freeze up. Like, she can't move her hands, they're not working. And at this point, this is something that had happened to her before, but it would eventually pass, it would go away, and then she'd just go about her business and whatever. Now, your first thought might be, oh my gosh, why don't you go to the doctor? Don't ignore that. But dude, it's 1847. What are you supposed to do about it? She goes into the next room, and this part I think is actually really weird because I don't know what this is supposed to help. She goes to soak her hands in vinegar, and as she's standing there soaking her hands, and she's just listening to everybody else have the rehearsal and goes on, she actually faints, and she never woke back up, and come to find out she just had a stroke. She just died. She was only 42 years old. And I think this was definitely a shock because people weren't expecting this. She was otherwise a very healthy person, and this was very unexpected. So when Felix found out, he fainted, and he was so upset about this that he couldn't attend the funeral. And then for the rest of that summer, Felix's friends would describe him as looking aged and sad. Which is really sad. I mean, you're so sad that you physically look that, and then your friends tell you that that's how you look. You need some better friends. So in October of that same year, so it's like, 5 months later or something like that, Felix started talking like really loud and really excitingly, all in English, to his wife Cecile. And she was like, what? But it was enough to where she started to like get a little freaked out by it, and she called the doctor. So doctor comes over, and he was like, yo, your husband just had a stroke. So about the next month or so, Felix is going in and out of consciousness. And then suddenly, like a month or so later, he sits up, and then he like shrieks and he screams, and then he lays back down, and he has another stroke. And he actually died of that stroke. So he died 6 months later after Fanny. He was only 38 years old. So I think this is actually interesting to note as well. There is definitely a family history here. Felix's and Fanny's grandfather, he died of a stroke. He was 57 when that happened. Dad and their mom also died of strokes. Dad was 59 years old, mom was 65 years old, a little bit older. And now, here's the two of them. Fanny was 42 years old, Felix was 38 years old. I'm not sure what the other two siblings died of. Don't have information on them. So how do we remember them today? We actually do remember them as individuals, Felix more so than Fanny. We remember Felix as being a German romantic composer, performer, and conductor. He is someone who wrote in the romantic style. And I think also he's pretty well known for bringing back Johann Sebastian Bach's music. And I really think that if Felix hadn't have rediscovered his music, we would not be paying attention to Bach stuff today. So thanks, Felix. Now, Fanny Mendelssohn, while she had some amazing and fantastic compositions, we don't really talk about her stuff too much today. Unless it is to point out the inequality between the opportunities that Felix had that she did not. And it really does make you wonder, had she been given the same opportunities that her brother was given, what would we be listening to today? Would she have been better than her brother? I would like to thank you for joining me on this week's episode of Composer Tea. Kitty has been sitting on the other side of the living room staring at me. I think he's doing it on purpose. You know how cats do that? Like they do things on purpose and you're like, brat. It's fine, Kitty. I love you. I do love him. All right. I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me. Bye.